In the summer of 1861, deep in Louisiana's sugar country, parish records began to whisper something they did not dare say aloud. On the books, it looked simple enough within one planter's household. 3 infants, each an heir to a family name, heavy with wealth and land, were buried within weeks of each other. The cause of death, written in the same rigid hand, carried the same vague word again and again: fever. To the world beyond it, was explained away as summer sickness, one more misfortune of swamp air and heat. But inside that household, whispers moved differently. They said the infants had all been placed in the arms of a single woman, a black wet nurse, enslaved. Her own child, unnamed, had been left to die, in silence noted only in the parish book. Her body was taken to feed the lineage that had erased her own. And soon the children who drank from her began to waste away. More than a century later, when workers pried open warped floorboards in the ruins of that same house, they uncovered a trunk hidden in darkness. Inside were objects preserved against time, scraps of cloth stained with bitter herbs, roots bound neatly with string, and a small leather-bound journal. Its entries were measured, calm, almost clinical, quiet acts of feeding and balance, each ending with the same word returned. This was not folklore. This was a ledger of vengeance kept in plain sight. Nourishment transformed into undoing, grief into patient annihilation. And at the center, a woman whose body became the instrument of fire. Tonight we open her journal. We follow the path from parish silence to oral tradition, from coded words to the language of modern science. And we arrive at the chilling line that reframes her story entirely. They fed on me. I fed them back. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Share your country and your local time in the comments below. And if you want more histories like this one, stories buried in archives hidden in silence, subscribe to the 7th Mark and ring the bell so you never miss what history tried to erase. In the brittle ledgers of St. James Parish, Louisiana, the year 1861 hides its truths carefully. The entries for May through July look ordinary at first glance, a clerk's routine notations of births, deaths, and marriages. Yet tucked into the faded ink are 3 deaths that resist every easy explanation. Each belonged to the same household. Each was a child under 2. Each was marked with the same curt word: fever. No further cause. No mention of epidemic. No suggestion that neighbors suffered the same losses. In fact, in the entire parish, records show only 1 other child lost that summer. But in this one house, 3 heirs vanished before their names could take root. Of course, infant death was tragically common in the 19th century. Louisiana summers bred malaria, and doctors spoke of seasonal decline. But repetition clustered in one household defies coincidence. Yet parish officials asked no questions. They wrote what was safe to write: fever, a word broad enough to shield silence. It was common practice. In antebellum, Louisiana death certificates were not about medical accuracy, they were about social preservation. To write too precisely risked scandal accusation, even implication of intent. For families of standing generality was protection. Physicians leaned heavily on euphemism, miasma for what they could not explain, decline for what they dared not investigate. As one historian later wrote, the vaguer the cause, the higher the status of the deceased. But these particular entries resist the comfort of time. 3 children gone in succession in a house with wealth enough to summon doctors, nurses, priests. The neat explanation of summer sickness collapses when confined to one roof. Why here? Why this family and not their neighbors? Hints remain faint but unsettling. A nearby estate's ledger refers to a house of sorrow. A church record notes that prayers were requested, but no priest ever signed a burial entry. As though ritual was observed but distance kept. As though grief was acknowledged but cause avoided. For nearly a century, the lines lay quietly in the parish book unremarked. Generations of researchers passed them by, accustomed to death as background to the 19th century. Only later, when the numbers were compared against broader statistics, did the silence sharpen. 3 deaths within weeks, all confined to the walls of a single plantation household. This was not, as the record so blandly suggested, a stroke of chance. It was a pattern. And patterns, when they surface in silence, demand explanation. What could link these deaths? A disease that touched no one else. Neglect so grave it could not be admitted. Or something more deliberate, an act concealed in the safety of a single word written in ink meant to smooth over scandal. The next chapter of this story is not written by the clerk's hand at all. It is written in the body of a woman whose name the official record barely acknowledges. In the parish ledgers, she appears only once listed, not as family, not even as servant, but as nurse, her entry placed below livestock and tools in a household inventory. Yet her presence shaped the destiny of every child in that house. The brittle pages of St. James Parish, Louisiana, for the year 1861 appear at first glance unremarkable. Births, deaths, and marriages neatly logged in the stiff hand of the county clerk. But among the faded ink stand 3 entries that defy explanation. Each death tied to the same planter's household. Each life ended before the 2nd year. Each explained with the same curt word, fever. No further cause. No mention of epidemic. No call for quarantine. The surrounding pages record only one other child lost in the entire parish during those months. Yet, within this one home, 3 heirs were buried before their names could be carried forward. Yes, infant death was tragically common in the 19th century. Louisiana's swamps bred malaria. Its humid summers brought what physicians called seasonal decline. But 3 deaths in such close succession under one roof resist the logic of chance. The parish authorities, however, did not question. They wrote what was safe to write. Fever. A word that both revealed and obscured a shield against scandal. This was no accident of language. In antebellum, Louisiana, a death certificate was less a medical document than a social instrument. To specify too clearly risked implication, contagion, neglect, or worse, intentional harm. For families of standing, the safer course was vagueness. Physicians leaned on euphemism as a matter of habit, miasma, for what they could not see, decline in place of investigation. As one historian later observed, the vaguer the cause, the higher the status of the deceased. And yet, these particular records refuse the comfort of abstraction. 3 children lost despite the presence of doctors, nurses, priests. The neat explanation of summer sickness collapses when contained within a single set of walls. Why did death circle this house and spare its neighbors? Even in the moment, faint hints suggest unease. An account book on a neighboring estate mentions that house of sorrow, though it does not name who lived there. A church ledger records that prayers were requested, but no priest signed any burial entry. The family grieved, the community performed ritual, but no one looked too closely at the cause. For nearly a century, the parish book rested undisturbed. Scholars paging through later years passed quickly over these entries, accustomed to treating infant death as background noise of 19th century life. Only when the data was compared against broader parish statistics did the anomaly sharpen into focus. 3 deaths in weeks in one house alone. This was not chance. It was a pattern, and at its center stood a woman whose story was never meant to be told. Reduced in the ledgers to a single word, nurse listed beneath animals and tools, she shaped the fate of every child placed in her arms. The records raise the question. She thou silenced offers the answer. The woman at the center offers the answer. In the planter's house, the signs first came so subtly, they were almost dismissed. The boy, strongest of the family's infants, had entered the world with the glow of health. Neighbors spoke admiringly of his sturdy frame, the flush of red in his cheeks. He was his household's pride, a visible promise of continuation, in a year when war crept toward Louisiana's borders. But in June of 1861, barely a month after he was placed fully under the care of the wet nurse, something began to shift. His cries lost strength. His appetite grew restless. He fed constantly, yet his body shrank. The soft roundness of his limbs melted away, replaced by pallor and exhaustion. His once bright eyes began to glaze as though fixed on corners no one else could see. The family summoned a physician. He arrived in a pressed black coat, carrying a leather case filled with the tools of mid-19th century medicine, glass vials of tinctures, steel instruments polished more for show than effect. He examined the child with detached precision, pressing lightly on the stomach, counting shallow breaths, feeling the faint pulse. He asked questions but gave no answers. His notes, preserved in the family ledger, described the case as infantile decline. He attributed it vaguely to the heat, the swamps, to what he called summer weakness. He prescribed camphor tonic, a change of linen, and prayer. His handwriting betrayed no urgency, no recognition that the child's condition demanded anything more than patience. The boy worsened each day. The wet nurse was instructed to feed him more often, to keep him pressed to her breast at every sound of fussing. She obeyed, outwardly calm, inwardly silent. The mistress sat nearby, watching anxiously, while the physician returned only to repeat his earlier assurances, the season takes its toll. Yet in the quarters, the enslaved women murmured a different account. They had seen the boy's strength before, and they knew his decline began only once his nourishment came solely from her. The word returned was never spoken, but glances were exchanged heavy with understanding. They had seen other women find quiet ways of resistance methods hidden within the body where no overseer's eye could intrude. Still nothing could be said. To voice suspicion meant death not only for her but perhaps for others as well. Silence was survival. And so they watched and waited as the planter's air wasted not from swamp air but from something closer, something more intimate. By late July, the boy was gone. His death was recorded with the same blunt word that had already claimed so many others' fever. The parish entry carried no detail, no distinction. The child celebrated at birth disappeared into the general tide of mortality that swept away so many in the South, accepted by families as providence. There was no scandal, no accusation, no grief beyond the household walls. But in the quarters, the women's eyes did not leave her. They noted her stillness, her composure, her gaze that lingered not on the grieving mistress, but on the patch of earth where her own child lay in an unmarked grave. Why did the strongest child die first? Why only after being entrusted to her alone? The questions never passed a physician's lips. Yet, they did not vanish, and soon they would not concern only one child. Within weeks, the second infant followed the same path. A girl born weaker, her survival always uncertain. At first, her decline was explained away delicate constitution, the physician remarked, but the pattern was undeniable. Like her brother, she was placed solely in the care of the wet nurse. Unlike him, she weakened with each passing day. Her cries thinned to whimpers. Her body grew rigid with discomfort. No matter how often she fed, she failed to grow. The first death could be dismissed as chance as providence. The second, coming so quickly after, made silence heavier, harder to sustain. What the parish clerk recorded as fever now revealed itself as something else, entirely a pattern, repeating with a precision that the record could not disguise. The physician returned coat damp with sweat manner, rehearsed. He repeated the same phrases he had given for her brother: seasonal decline, miasma, infantile fever. His notes carried no urgency. With a polite bow, his leather case as closed as his mind, he departed. The mistress of the house clung to his words. To visiting relatives, she blamed the swamp air unusually heavy that summer. She spoke of God's mysterious will. To suggest otherwise was to entertain the unthinkable, that someone within her own walls was the agent of her grief. And so denial became her shield, just as fever became the records. In the quarters, however, whispers moved differently. The women noticed that no other children in the parish were dying that summer. They observed that only the infants nursed solely at her breast declined. Some crossed themselves in silence. Others exchanged glances that carried old knowledge. They understood truths the physicians never would, that what nourishes can also wound, that the body itself can be made an instrument of resistance. The wet nurse carried herself with silence, her face unreadable, her voice restrained. She obeyed every command, appeared in every ledger as dutiful and indispensable. To the mistress, she was essential. To the enslaved, she was something else, an instrument of justice, moving quietly inside captivity. The second infant died within a week of her brother. Again, the parish entry read only fever. Again, the household mourned privately, prayers covering fears too dangerous to name. 2 deaths in succession should have roused alarm. But the planter refused suspicion. He called it God's testing. He blamed the marsh, the season, anything but the woman whose presence sustained his children. To dismiss her was unthinkable. To lose her might imperil the infants who remained. And so, she stayed her place unchallenged. By now, the whispers in the quarters had taken on a sharper edge. 2 children gone, both tied to her milk. It was too precise, too measured to be chance. Some feared she carried a curse. Others recognized something more deliberate. A knowledge kept alive beneath silence, a knowledge that could turn the act of nursing into both sustenance and weapon. If the planter family knew the risk, why did they keep her? Denial played its part, as did dependence. But the deeper reason lay in blindness. They never imagined such knowledge could exist. never suspected that power might reside in the very body they presumed to own. The truth was not in the parish record, nor in the physician's notebook, but in traditions whispered across generations. Knowledge of herbs, roots, and leaves brought across the Atlantic, reshaped by Louisiana's soil, survived in memory, passed hand to hand. The enslaved were forced to labor with their bodies, but within them, they carried a science their captors dismissed. A handful of bitter roots steeped in water could ease a cough. Bark could soothe childbirth pains. With subtle changes, those same preparations could weaken or even kill, leaving no trace to the untrained eye. Women guarded this knowledge most closely. Midwives, caregivers, healers preserved recipes never written down. Overseers could scour letters, planters could catalog sugar and tools, but they could not enter memory. What was whispered in kitchens at birthbeds or beneath the cover of night remained hidden. Sometimes it slipped into stories, a phrase like feeding back, carrying both the literal act of nursing and the quiet return of suffering to those who inflicted it. For women, denied every visible form of power, such knowledge offered a rare kind of resistance. It could not topple the plantation, but it could bend the most intimate balances of life and death within it. A nurse whose own child had been sacrificed to her mistress's needs could turn that theft back upon the lineage of her oppressors. No overseer could see it, no physician could prove it. To the planter's family, it looked like providence, like swamp air, like fever. To those who knew it was justice, hidden in nourishment, she was not alone. Across plantations, women shared seeds beneath baskets' roots in hems, recipes whispered over childbirth beds. In those exchanges, grief became knowledge. Knowledge became survival, and sometimes survival became vengeance. The deaths of the planter's first 2 infants were never named as acts of resistance. They were swallowed by the bland word fever. Yet among the enslaved, that silence spoke loudly. The pattern was seen, recognized, understood. What made it so powerful was its invisibility. It required no blade, no open defiance, only the quiet body of a woman, already bound in chains. The overseers could command her movements, but not the chemistry of her milk. They could order her service, but not strip away the knowledge that turned sustenance into poison. Her revenge lay in recipes no overseer could read, in knowledge preserved beneath silence. The evidence was not in the physician's notes, but in the timing of deaths, in whispers that lingered in a journal uncovered a century later. And as the months passed, her influence spread further. For soon it was not only infants who withered under her care. The mistress herself, weakened after childbirth, would ask for the same comfort, and her decline would prove harder to explain. By the end of that summer, sickness had seeped beyond the nursery. The mistress's bedroom, lined with lace curtains and polished mahogany, became its next chamber. She had given birth only weeks before the second infant's death. Her body remained fragile, her spirit frayed by grief. Physicians prescribed bed rest, cool draughts, broth, and cordial. None restored her. She lay restless in confinement, haunted by sleepless nights, and hollow she could not name. It was then she turned to the nurse. In certain households, it was not uncommon for a mother to drink from her wet nurse, a practiced thought to restore humors, hasten recovery, calm nerves. Desperate, the mistress accepted. What had been demanded for her infants now extended to herself. At first, she swore it soothed her. She whispered to her husband that it brought her calm. The arrangement remained discreet, but the household knew. And still the nurse obeyed in silence. Yet soon the mistress's body betrayed her. The pallor that had overtaken her children crept across her face. Her cheeks hollowed. Her hands trembled. Her voice grew thin. Servants who tended the room noticed the change in her breath, shallow and strained. She complained of dizziness, of weakness, of a bitter taste that never left her tongue. Physicians returned again and again, recording her wasting with detached words, exhaustion, postpartum frailty, nervous decline. Their diagnoses shifted with each visit, never fixing on a cause. None imagined that what she consumed in secrecy, what was meant to restore her, might be the very agent of her wasting. In the quarters, the enslaved women understood more. They whispered that what had been taken from the nurse's own child was now returned to the mistress. They did not gloat. They did not speak openly, but their silence was not ignorance, it was recognition. They had always known the body could wound as well as heal. The contrast was cruel and exact. The mistress lay in linen sheets, shaded by lace curtains, cooled by pitchers of water, and attended by servants. Yet, she depended entirely on the same woman she owned, her life tethered to the breast she commanded. What appeared as luxury was in truth a dependence she could never admit. As weeks passed, her decline grew undeniable. Each day thinner, each day weaker. The physicians still clung to their vague explanations. They blamed the season, the swamp, the damp air of the parish. Their words, like the parish records, concealed more than they revealed. If her milk was death, how many more would drink before silence could no longer protect them? The answer did not lie in grief alone. It lay in the very notes the doctors composed, pages where bland diagnoses stood in place of scandal, where uncertainty was crafted as carefully as any cure. They came and went through the oak doors of the planter's house, Booth's polished voices steady with Latin phrases that disguised their doubt. They touched frail wrists, peered at pale tongues, listened to shallow breaths. And they wrote what would shield the family's name, not what had truly taken root in their home. The first child, they declared, had succumbed to summer fever. The second, to infantile decline. And the mistress, her weakness, was written down as exhaustion no more. The mistress, growing weaker by the day, was marked with miasma, a word stretched thin enough to cover nearly anything. Other notes invoked consumption, though no cough ever racked her chest, or general exhaustion, though no cause was ever pursued. Each word was a veil, chosen not to clarify, but to obscure. The language of antebellum medicine served multiple masters. It soothed the planter family, sparing them the shame of suspicion. It preserved the physicians' reputations who could claim diagnosis without admitting ignorance. And most of all, it kept the plantation system intact. To admit foul play within a house of standing would be to crack the veneer of order upon which the entire structure rested. Medicine in this era was performance as much as science. Doctors carried leeches, syringes, vials of cordial, but more often they carried words. Decline, fever, weakness. Words that satisfied families who sought not truth but reassurance. A diagnosis that blamed swamp air or the season carried no scandal. It accused no one. It rendered death inevitable, and in inevitability lay absolution. The silences were deliberate. Nowhere in the physician's ledgers is there a question why deaths clustered so tightly under one roof. Nowhere is the wet nurse mentioned, though she was the common factor in every decline. To name her was to invite suspicion, and suspicion would be ruinous. This was the institutional silence of antebellum medicine. Doctors owed their survival not to accuracy, but to patronage. Their clients were the planter elite. Their reputations depended on discretion. Any physician who dared suggest poison, let alone resistance from within the household, would never be summoned again. Safer to write miasma, collect a fee, and depart. The enslaved saw through the theatre. In the quarters, the women exchanged looks heavier than words. They recognized knowledge carried in the body, knowledge the physicians would never record. Among the white neighbors, too, whispers surfaced. Condolences delivered at the door gave way to unease on the road home. Some murmured of curses. Others muttered of swamp fevers, of damp earth and cane field fogs. To speak of season and air was safe. It explained everything and accused no one. Yet, even among them, hesitation lingered. How strange, they said, that the fevers spared the fields, spared the overseer's children, spared the neighbors. How strange that they touched only those fed by the same woman. Still, no one spoke the word poison. To do so would be to admit danger lived within the household itself, an accusation too destabilizing to allow. Inside the quarters, the whispers carried a different tone. The enslaved did not speak of curses or vapors. They knew the wet nurse's story, her own child dead, and unnamed her milk taken by force, her grief turned into sustenance for others. They marked the timing of each death, the steady wasting of bodies pressed to her breast. But their silence was deliberate. To expose her was to sign her death warrant. To protect her was to keep alive the faintest possibility of justice. They shared knowing glances, traded half phrases past stories disguised as warnings to children. Do not drink what is offered too freely. Do not take what is given without care. Within those whispers lived the acknowledgement of what she had done, or what she might have done without ever naming it aloud. This was not loyalty born of affection but of recognition. The women of the quarters understood her rage because it was their own. Each had buried children unnamed. Each had known the hollow ache of grief met with indifference. In her silence, they saw themselves. In her revenge, they glimpsed a truth they could never voice, and so the nurse moved untouched by accusation. To the mistress, she was indispensable. To the physicians, invisible. To the enslaved, she was more. A woman who had turned grief into something no overseer could chain. Her silence was their silence. Her survival was theirs too. But silence is rarely permanent. What parish records obscured and physicians ignored would not stay hidden forever. A century later, long after the plantation fell into ruin, its name fading from memory, the house was gutted for renovation. In 1957, beneath warped floorboards, workers struck a trunk. Its wood was swollen with damp, its hinges red with rust. At first it seemed ordinary, a forgotten chest of tools or clothing. But when pried open, the air that escaped carried not cedar or linen, but earth herbs and something faintly bitter. Inside lay objects that resisted explanation. Cloth scraps folded with care stained and brittle. Bundles of dried roots and leaves tied with crumbling string. A pouch of powder, faintly sweet with the scent of almonds. And at the bottom, pressed flat, a journal, bound in rough leather, its pages browned but legible. The entries were plain, the hand careful, but the words were coded. The child has eaten, one line, read. The season is answered, said another. Again and again, phrases cloaked in the rhythms of domestic duty, but pulsing with something deeper. Historians would later note the alignment of dates feedings marked beside death's roots, steeped on the eve of decline. No confessions, no accusations, only the silence of what was implied. It was not chance that herbs, cloth, and words had been preserved together. The trunk was less a hiding place than a message left for those yet to come, as though she meant for her testimony to outlast her body. The men who opened it felt unease turning the objects in their hands, unsure if they held relics or evidence. Local historians called to examine. The find spoke of a weight in the pages as though a voice, long muted, had chosen that moment to speak again, not loudly, but with the same quiet force it once wielded in life. And still in the parish archives, the children's deaths remain marked as fever. The physician's notes still spoke of miasma and decline. Yet here beneath floorboards, sealed for a century, was a counter-archive, the hidden testimony of a woman reduced to property, but who had rewritten the fate of a household. Her journal did not read like confession. It read like balance. Each entry was an account brief and measured as though grief itself had been tallied line by line. A cloth steeped in bitter infusion, roots chewed until sharpness filled the mouth, powder faint with the scent of almonds sprinkled in silence. Nowhere did she write poison, nowhere death. Only the plain notations of daily care the child has eaten, the feeding complete, the balance acknowledged. And then at the end of every entry, one word returned. The word appeared without flourish, written steady and exact. Not murder, not vengeance. Returned. A debt repaid. A measure settled. A life for a life. In that repetition, the journal became more than record. It was manifesto. It declared that what had been taken, her child, her milk, her body was not forgotten. It was accounted for, and it was returned in kind. Historians would later debate intent. Was it confession left to survive her erasure, or ritual binding grief into words only she could read? Whatever the answer, the power of that word lay in its restraint. Where physicians obscured with fever, she clarified with returned. Where their language preserved reputation, hers preserved truth. What unsettles most is not the evidence of poison, though the herbs and powders make it clear, but the calmness of the hand. No rage, no plea. Only the quiet rhythm of someone recording what was owed and how it was collected. Within a year of the final entry, the lineage was gone. Infants buried, mistress wasted, the family name extinguished. By 1862, the plantation stood hollow, its nursery silent, its cradles unused, its wealth scattered like ash. The parish registers list no heirs. The house that once embodied permanence had collapsed not by war or fire, but by the steady hand of a woman who refused to let her losses go unpaid. The deaths rippled outward like fractures through glass. With no heirs, creditors circled. Notes once secured by lineage dissolved into paper. The plantation's value, once dynastic, became mere acreage soil to be parceled and sold. The courthouse records show the decline in brutal clarity. Mortgages called due auctions announced furniture dispersed portraits sold. Overseers drifted to new wages. Enslaved families were torn apart, divided by the strike of a gavel. What had been presented as permanence collapsed faster than war itself. No cannon fire, no rebellion, only the quiet reckoning of a woman's body. The planters had treated her as resource, as land measured, consumed, owned. They believed her milk secured their future. They never imagined that within it lay their undoing. Their fall passed into ledgers as fever decline. But among the enslaved, silence carried the truth it was her. The wet nurse who had returned what was taken. And yet, in the records of the sale, her name is absent. She is listed only as female age 27 property. The woman who unmade a dynasty is reduced to a line of ink filed beside livestock. She disappears into the machinery of trade, her presence swallowed, her intent erased. This was the final irony. The house that depended upon her body fell because of it, yet her identity was stripped away. The planter's lineage dissolved into obscurity. She who had ended it dissolved by design. To name her would have been to admit she had power. And so, the record preserved the ruin, but not the hand that caused it. Her ledger spoke in one word returned. Theirs erased her entirely. The absence itself becomes a kind of testimony. To read the record is to encounter her ghost, a figure central and invisible. The family destroyed the destroyer unnamed. Silence persists. Parish ledgers note only fever decline, property sold. It is as though the archive itself conspired to bury her deeper than the floorboards that hid her journal. And yet, absence can speak. She was essential enough to sustain a dynasty, yet unworthy of a name when that dynasty collapsed. Her body carried both their future and their end. Their extinction came from fragility, hers from design. Was this silence her protection or her punishment? The ledgers give no answer. But beyond the ink, another record endured. In cabins along the river, in kitchens, in songs and whispers, her story lived. Children heard it first as warning, what you take in may burn you out. Elders understood it as power reclaimed. They called her the woman of bitter milk, the nurse who burned. Each retelling preserved her where the courthouse had erased her. Some details matched the objects, later uncovered cloths pressed to the skin roots, chewed until the mouth filled with sharpness, powders measured into silence. These fragments carried orally survived as both memory and instruction. The whisper became its own archive, challenging the authority of paper. You cannot erase her with property sold. The ledger silences, but the story endures. For decades, two truths ran in parallel: the silence of the record, the persistence of the voice, which carried more weight. In the late 20th century, science tipped the balance. When the trunk was opened in 1957, its contents seemed trivial: cloth scraps, dried roots, a pouch of powder, a spare journal. But analysis decades later revealed otherwise. The cloths bore traces of cyanogenic toxins, the bitter almond compounds long known as silent killers. The oral record had preserved what the archive refused. The items on the surface seemed like mere superstitions, relics of a forgotten servant's private ritual. For decades, they sat in the County Historical Society's archives, catalogued without comment, alongside rusty tools and yellowing maps. It was only in the 1980s, as part of a broader effort to re-examine the history of the plantation, that researchers turned their attention to the diary. Scholars turned the pages, the brief, careful notes about feeding and balancing, each line ending with a single word returned. Some thought it was a metaphor, a text more symbolic than a true record. But others recognized in the simple words, a record too precise to ignore. The old rags became the key. Though brittle and faded, they still bore the faintest traces of use. The sample was sent for chemical analysis, and the results stunned even cautious researchers. The fibers bore traces of cyanogenic compounds, chemicals characteristic of bitter almonds, which in African and African American herbal traditions can both heal and harm. The results did not prove intent, but they opened up a distinct possibility. A piece of cloth soaked in roots pressed against the skin could release toxins into the body. Combined with the diary entries, the message emerged the servant had turned her own milk into a weapon, using herbal knowledge that doctors could not recognize, that her master knew nothing about, but that she kept in her own secret notebooks. Historians have fiercely debated. Some still cling to the safe side, calling it folklore myths tied to scientific experimentation. Others insist that this is true, that in the fabric and ink of the notebook, there is evidence of a silent resistance carried out through the most intimate of actions, her body and her milk. For the black community along the river, the tests only confirm what their elders have whispered for generations. The woman who fed the fire with her body is no longer a legend. She has lived, acted, and left a mark to be heard even after a century of silence. Her legacy is not in the official records. Official histories still call it fever and exhaustion. The museum's information board describes the chest as a mere relic of custom, careful never to call it resistance. But the truth, even if proven, remains reserved. Each page of the diary is a silent testimony, and on the last page, a different line, cold and decisive, erases all doubt they fed on me. I fed them back. Brief, direct. The line is both a confession and a manifesto. It acknowledges what doctors deny, what local records erase, what the community of servants whispers. Her body was used, her milk was taken, her child was denied, and she weaponized it all. The simplicity of the words makes it all the more brutal. No exclamations, no flourishes, just the recognition that what was taken, she returned, transformed, reversed. She does not call herself a murderer, she does not call it justice. She simply describes a symmetry. In that symmetry, there is both revenge and restoration. For the woman whose name was erased from the records as property sold, the line restores power. She is not just a victim. She reshapes the terms of her subjection. Milk, which was seen as the source of life for the masters, becomes their end. She was forced to nurse, but she chose what it meant. Historians wonder, was it physical, using poison to destroy the descendants of a plantation family? Or was it symbolic writing, pain as retribution? Either way, the power of her words lies in their inability to be silenced. Even when local records erased her name, even when the census listed her as property sold, even when doctors called her actions fever and exhaustion, her own voice remained. Under the floorboards hidden for a century, she left a record that spoke for her when no one else could. The story does not stop at what was done. It reminds us how many other women forced to become nurses, midwives, caregivers who turned the instruments of oppression, their bodies, their milk, their care into weapons that history does not record. The records are silent, but silence does not mean absence. The missing notebooks, the undiscovered pieces of cloth, the whispered stories all suggest that she may not have been the only one to give back in this silent way. The final line closes the diary, but it does not resolve the story. It redefines the whole. This is not just murder, not just revenge. This is restoring humanity in a world that has stripped her of even her name. A stolen body turned into a weapon. A woman whose name has been erased becomes the end of a lineage. And what remains now is not closure, but uncertainty. For every chest discovered, how many more are still lying on the floor? How many women have turned tools of oppression into weapons that history never recorded? This is not a legend. This is milestone 7. If you made it to the end, leave a returned comment below so we know who else walked through the dark corners of history. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, and join us as we continue to uncover the stories that the records have tried to erase.